The man struck Margaret's fence hard enough to break the top rail, then disappeared beneath the blowing snow. She dropped the armful of firewood against the kitchen floor and ran to the window. A stranger lay face down beside the gate, one bare hand stretched toward the house. Blood darkened the snow beneath his palm, and the wind was already covering his tracks. Whoever he was, he had only minutes left. Margaret pulled on her late husband's wool coat, wrapped the scarf across her face, and fought her way down the hill. The storm struck like a living thing, stealing her breath and hiding the barn 20 yards away. She found the stranger half buried, his coat frozen stiff and his skin gray with cold. He tried to speak, but only one broken word came out. "Please." She hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and dragged him toward the porch. At 62, Margaret no longer trusted her knees, but she refused to let go. 3 years earlier, she had watched her husband die in the bed upstairs, helpless against a fever no doctor could stop. She would not stand at another window and watch death take someone while warmth waited inside her home. By the time she pulled the stranger across the threshold, he had stopped shivering. That frightened her more than anything. Margaret barred the door, moved him close to the iron stove, and cut away the frozen cloth around his wounded hand. His fingers were scarred from years of hard work, but there was something careful in the way he held himself, even near unconsciousness. Sewn inside his coat was a small silver locket bearing a woman's faded portrait. If you had been alone on that Montana hillside, with darkness closing in and a stranger bleeding on your floor, would you have opened your door? Margaret warmed broth, tore fresh bread into small pieces, and lifted the cup to his lips. At first, he could not swallow. Then his throat moved once. A moment later, his eyes opened. They were tired eyes, carrying the look of a man who had traveled farther through grief than through snow. "You're safe now," Margaret said. The stranger stared at the fire, then at the bread in her hand. His mouth trembled before he turned away. "It's been a long time," he whispered, "since anyone cared whether I lived." Before Margaret could answer, a heavy sound came from beyond the walls. Not thunder, not a falling branch. Hoofbeats. They stopped at the broken fence. And someone outside began walking toward her door. Daniel slept through most of the night, while the storm battered every wall of the little farmhouse. Margaret hardly slept at all. She fed the stove every hour, checked the blanket covering the stranger, and listened between the howl of the wind for the hoofbeats she had heard before. They never reached the porch. By dawn, only drifting snow remained beyond the windows. When the first pale light slipped across the kitchen floor, Daniel stirred. He tried to sit up too quickly, and pain forced him back into the chair beside the stove. "Easy," Margaret said, placing another log on the fire. "Your body's been through enough." He gave a quiet nod. "Much obliged." She poured steaming coffee into a chip mug and set a bowl of thick potato soup beside fresh bread she had baked before the storm. Daniel hesitated before touching either one. "You expecting someone else?" Margaret asked gently. He looked down at the table. "I guess I've forgotten what it feels like when kindness doesn't come with a price." Margaret smiled without pity. "Then today's a good day to remember." For several quiet minutes, the only sound were the crackling stove and the wind fading outside. Daniel ate slowly, almost carefully, as though every bite deserved respect. Margaret noticed he never wasted a crumb. Years of hardship had taught him habits that comfort alone could not erase. Only after the meal did she unwrap the bandage around his hand. The cut was deep but clean. "You've worked with tools most of your life," she observed. Daniel glanced at the calluses covering his palms. "I reckon that's one thing no bad year can take away." Margaret did not ask what that bad year had been. Instead, she opened the front door. The world outside glittered beneath fresh snow. Fence posts leaned where the storm had struck. One section of rail had collapsed completely. Daniel stepped onto the porch despite her protest. "I can still swing a hammer. You can barely stand." "I've rested enough." Within minutes he was lifting broken rails, setting new posts upright, and packing snow away from the gate. His movements were slow because of the injured hand, Yet every motion showed the confidence of a man who has spent decades building things meant to last. Margaret watched from the porch with quiet surprise. Her late husband, William, had repaired that same fence every spring. Seeing another pair of weathered hands working their stir memories she had believed were buried beneath 3 long winters. Without a word, she carried Daniel another cup of coffee. He accepted it with a grateful smile. "Your husband built this place?" "He did. He built it well. He always said a home ought to outlive the people inside it." Daniel looked across the ranch, where the barn stood against the white hills like an old soldier refusing to surrender. He was right. By afternoon, they had cleared the path to the chicken coop, repaired enough fencing to keep the livestock safe, and stacked fallen firewood beside the porch. Margaret shook her head. "You came here half-frozen." Daniel chuckled softly. "And now you've got me earning breakfast. You already earned it by surviving." For the first time since arriving, genuine warmth reached Daniel's eyes as the sun dipped behind the Montana hills. He quietly reached into his coat pocket and removed an old pocketknife. The wooden handle had been worn smooth by decades of use. "My father carried this nearly his whole life." Margaret immediately pushed it back toward him. "I can't take that. I'd like you to. It's too valuable." Daniel closed her fingers gently around it. "When I walked through that storm, I wasn't looking for another town." He paused, searching for words. "I was looking for one last reason not to give up." Margaret remained silent. "The night before," he continued, "I thought about letting the snow finish what grief had already started." His voice nearly failed him. "My wife passed 2 years ago. After that, everything else seemed to fall apart." Margaret's eyes softened. She understood too well the silence left behind after losing the person who had shared every ordinary day. "You don't have to explain," she said quietly. "I know." For several moments, they simply stood together beneath the fading light. No speeches, no promises, only 2 lonely souls recognizing pain they never wished upon another. The next morning, the roads had finally opened. Daniel placed a small pack over one shoulder. "I suppose it's time." Margaret walked him to the gate. "You owe me nothing." "I know." He reached into her hand and closed her fingers around the old pocketknife once more. "Keep it." "I still can't." "Please." "So, you'll remember where it is?" He smiled faintly. "So I'll remember there's still goodness left in this world." Margaret watched him disappear down the snow-covered road until only his footprints remained. She carried the knife back inside and laid it carefully on the mantel above the fireplace. Outside, the storm was finally over. But neither of them knew the simple meal shared beside that old iron stove had only begun changing both of their lives. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Montana hills. Snowbanks shrank into muddy streams, meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, and the first hints of green pushed through the frozen earth. Margaret welcomed every sign of spring, but the changing season did not make life any easier. The roof leaked whenever it rained. One corner of the horse barn leaned farther each week. Several fence posts Daniel had temporarily repaired during the storm now needed replacing for good. Every evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with a pencil, adding numbers that never seemed to work in her favor. She had enough money to survive. She did not have enough to save a ranch. One afternoon, the telephone rang. "Emma." "Mom," her daughter said gently, "you don't have to keep doing this alone." Margaret smiled as she looked through the window toward the weathered pasture. "I've managed this far. But at what cost? Every time I visit, something else needs fixing. It's an old ranch. It's becoming too much for one person." Emma paused before speaking again. "You could sell it. Come live near me. We'd find you a lovely little house." Margaret rested her hand on the worn kitchen table, where she and William had shared thousands of ordinary meals. "I appreciate that, sweetheart. But this house still feels like home." Emma sighed softly. "I just don't want to lose you, too." After promising to call again soon, Margaret gently placed a receiver back onto its cradle. She knew her daughter spoke from love, not impatience. Still, Leaving the ranch felt like saying goodbye to William all over again. That evening she polished the old pocketknife Daniel had left behind. The wooden handle had grown smooth from decades of faithful use. She wondered where he was now, whether he had truly found the fresh start he had hoped for, perhaps somewhere far beyond Montana. Perhaps he no longer even remembered the little farmhouse on the hill. She slipped the knife back onto the mantel. Life moved quietly onward. Weeks passed. Neighbors occasionally stopped by with eggs or fresh milk. Sheriff Tom rode over once to inspect a washed-out bridge near her property. "You keeping well, Margaret?" he asked. "I've had worse years." His experienced eyes wandered toward the sagging barn roof. "If you need help." "I know. You don't always have to carry everything yourself." She smiled. "I've never been very good at asking." Tom tipped his hat. William used to say exactly the same thing. The sheriff rode away, leaving Margaret standing alone beneath the wide Montana sky. Then one bright morning, long after the snow had disappeared, 3 slow knocks echoed across the porch. Not hurried, not demanding, just 3 steady knocks. Margaret wiped flour from her hands and opened the door. For a moment she simply stared. Daniel stood there. Only this time he looked like a different man. His beard had been neatly trimmed. His coat was clean and well-fitted. The tired emptiness that had haunted his eyes during the storm had been replaced by quiet confidence. Behind him waited 3 pickup trucks loaded with lumber, fence rails, windows, roofing supplies, and an old but sturdy tractor secured with heavy chains. Margaret blinked. "Daniel." He removed his hat. "Good morning." She looked past him toward the trucks. I don't understand." "I was hoping you'd let me explain." She stepped aside. "Of course." The drivers remained outside, while Daniel accepted a cup of coffee at the familiar kitchen table. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel rested both hands around the warm mug. "After I left here, I found my younger brother." Margaret listened quietly. We hadn't spoken in years. "He'd been looking for me." Daniel smiled faintly. "We settled a dispute over our family's property, sold the land we'd been fighting over. It was enough for both of us to begin again." Margaret's face brightened. "I'm glad." "So am I." He glanced toward the window overlooking the ranch. "But every good thing that happened afterward began here." He looked directly at her. "I never forgot the woman who opened her door to a stranger everyone else would have left in the snow." Margaret lowered her eyes. It was only supper. Daniel slowly shook his head. "No." His voice was steady. "It was hope." Silence settled gently between them. Then he reached into his pocket and placed a folded piece of paper on the table. Margaret unfolded it. It listed lumber, shingles, fencing wire, nails, windows, paint, feed, and farming equipment. Her eyes widened. "What is all this?" Daniel smiled. "The beginning." She looked outside again. "You bought all of that?" "I did." "You shouldn't have." "I know." "Then why?" Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "I'm not here to repay a bowl of soup." He paused. "I'm here to repay the debt kindness placed on my heart." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Before she could answer, truck doors opened outside. Men climbed down carrying toolboxes, ladders, and stacks of timber. Sheriff Tom rode into the yard almost at the same moment, wearing the biggest smile Margaret had seen in years. "I reckon we got ourselves a barn to rebuild," he called. Behind him came neighbors. The carpenter from town, the blacksmith, 2 ranch hands. Even the elderly couple from the next valley arrived carrying homemade pies for the workers. Margaret looked from one familiar face to another. "What is all this?" Tom chuckled. "Daniel came through town yesterday. He asked if anyone remembered William." Margaret smiled through tears. "They all did." "And then," Tom continued, "he asked if anyone would help the widow who'd once helped a stranger. Nobody said no. At BY noon, the quiet ranch echoed with the sounds of hammers instead of loneliness. Children carried nails. Women prepared lunch beneath the cottonwood trees. Men raised fresh beams where the old barn had leaned for years. Margaret stood on the porch holding Daniel's old pocketknife in one hand. Months earlier, she had believed she had saved one freezing traveler. Now she realized something far greater. Kindness had never left her doorstep. It had simply taken the long road home. By the third morning, the old ranch hardly looked like the lonely place Daniel had found beneath a blanket of snow months before. Fresh cedar boards replaced the broken fence. The sagging barn stood straight again beneath a brand-new roof. The porch had been reinforced. Windows no longer rattled in the wind, and the old tractor, weathered but dependable, rested proudly beside the stable, waiting for another season of honest work. For the first time in years, laughter drifted across the yard more often than silence. Margaret stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching neighbors work together. She had spent so many seasons believing grief was something carried alone. Now she realized kindness had a way of gathering people, one heart at a time. Daniel walked past carrying fresh lumber across one shoulder. "You've been working since sunrise," Margaret called. He smiled. "I've got a lot of lost years to make up for. You don't owe me this." He stopped beside the porch. "I know." "Then why keep saying yes every time someone asks for another job?" He looked toward the repaired barn. "Because this place deserves another chance." His answer was simple, but Margaret knew he wasn't speaking only about the ranch. The following afternoon, Sheriff Tom rode over once more. He tied his horse beside the porch and removed his hat. "I've been sheriff nearly 30 years, he said. "I've seen folks pay back money. I've seen folks pay back favors." He glanced toward Daniel repairing the stable door. "But I don't believe I've ever seen someone try so hard to repay simple kindness." Daniel laughed quietly without looking up. "You can't put a price on being given hope." Tom nodded. "No, sir, you surely can't." That evening, everyone gathered beneath strings of lanterns hanging between the cottonwood trees. Nothing had been planned. Someone simply brought a fiddle. Another neighbor arrived carrying smoked brisket. Children chased one another through the grass, while older ranchers swapped stories they had told 100 times before. Margaret had almost forgotten what her yard sounded like when it was full of life. Daniel sat quietly on the porch steps beside her. Neither hurried to speak. The silence between them had become comfortable. After several minutes, Margaret finally asked, "Where did you really think you were going that night?" Daniel watched the fading sunlight settle across the valley. "I wasn't sure. You told me you were looking for a place to begin again. I was, but that wasn't the whole truth." He lowered his eyes. "No." For a long moment, only the fiddle could be heard. Then he spoke. "After my wife, Sarah, passed away." His voice caught. "I stayed in our house because leaving felt like losing her twice." Margaret listened without interruption. "I stopped answering letters. I stopped visiting friends. I even stopped caring whether morning came." He drew a slow breath. "When the bank finally took the property, I packed what little I had left. The knife." Daniel smiled faintly. "My father's knife, and a photograph of Sarah. I kept walking. Some days I hoped I'd find work. Other days," he looked toward the mountains, "I hoped the cold would finish what grief had started." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You were ready to die." "I didn't exactly want death." He looked at her gently. "I just couldn't imagine life." The words settled between them with heartbreaking honesty. Daniel continued, "Then your porch light appeared through the storm. You opened the door before you knew my name. You handed me soup before you asked any questions." He smiled to himself. "I realized later, it wasn't the soup that saved me. It was the fact that somebody still believed I was worth saving." Margaret reached over without thinking. Her hand rested softly upon his. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Two people who had buried the loves of their lives understood certain things beyond words. A few days later, Emma drove up from the city. She climbed out of her car, expecting to find her mother struggling with another impossible repair. Instead, she stopped in complete surprise. The fences stood straight. Fresh paint covered the porch. Flower boxes had returned beneath the windows. The barn roof gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. Most surprising of all, her mother was laughing. Real laughter. the kind Emma had not heard since her father's final summer. She found Margaret planting flowers beside Daniel. "Mom!" Margaret stood and embraced her tightly. Emma looked toward Daniel. "So," Margaret smiled, "this is Daniel." Daniel tipped his hat politely. "It's nice meeting you, ma'am." Emma studied him for a long moment. Then she quietly asked her mother, "Is this why you sound different every time we talk on the phone lately?" Margaret laughed. "Do I?" "You do." Emma looked around the ranch once more. Months earlier, she had begged her mother to leave. Now she finally understood why Margaret never could. The ranch itself had never been the reason. Loneliness had been. And somehow, that loneliness was disappearing. Late that evening, Emma found Daniel repairing one last gate. "My mother smiles again," she said. Daniel kept tightening the final hinge. "I'm glad. I haven't seen that smile in years." He looked toward the farmhouse where Margaret's light glowed warmly through the kitchen window. "Neither have I." Emma folded her arms. "Are you planning to leave again?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. "I hadn't decided." She smiled knowingly. "I think you already have." The final repair was finished 2 mornings later. The trucks were packed. Neighbors returned home. The ranch stood stronger than it had in many years. Daniel carried his travel bag onto the porch. Margaret walked beside him to the gate, the same gate where they had quietly said goodbye after the snowstorm. Only this time spring birds sang from the fence posts instead of icy wind. Daniel rested one hand on the weathered wood. "I suppose this is where I thank you again." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "And then where will you go?" He searched the distant road before answering. "I don't rightly know." She smiled gently. "You've spent months rebuilding my home. But you never rebuilt one for yourself." Daniel looked back at her. For the first time in many years, he realized the answer had been standing in front of him all along. He removed his hat. He hesitated, suddenly more nervous than he had been during the worst snowstorm of his life. "If you'd allow it." Margaret waited quietly. "But I'd like to stay." The breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut pine across the yard. Neither of them noticed the old porch light still hanging above the door, the same light that had once guided a freezing stranger through the darkness. Now, it was lighting the way towards something neither of them had believed possible again. Summer settled gently over the Montana Valley, and the little ranch on the hillside seemed to breathe again. Wildflowers colored the fields where winter snow had once buried every path. The chickens wandered freely through the yard, horses grazed behind sturdy new fences, and the vegetable garden Margaret had almost abandoned was thriving once more. Every morning began the same way. Margaret baked fresh bread. Daniel carried feed to the barn. Neither rushed. Neither needed to fill every silence. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt shared. One afternoon, Sheriff Tom stopped by with a grin stretching beneath his gray mustache. "I don't reckon I've ever seen this place look finer." Daniel laughed. "It had good bones." Tom looked toward Margaret. "It always did." His eyes softened. "It just needed people living in it again." After Tom rode away, Margaret stood on the porch watching the dust settle behind his horse. "I used to think this ranch would be the last thing I ever held on to." Daniel leaned against the porch rail. "And now," she smiled, "I've learned a home isn't made of boards. It's made of the people who keep coming back." Daniel quietly lowered his eyes. There was nothing more to add. She had spoken the truth he had been carrying for months. Yet one small shadow still remained. Some nights Margaret woke before sunrise and instinctively looked through the front window. Years of living alone had taught her to listen for trouble. Sometimes a loose shutter. Sometimes coyotes in the distance. Sometimes nothing at all. Old fears rarely disappeared overnight. Daniel noticed without saying a word. Instead of telling her she was safe, he simply rose each morning before she did, walked the property, checked the barn doors, and made sure the front gate stood secure. Eventually, Margaret stopped waking so early, not because the world had become safer, but because someone else now shared the watch. Daniel carried his own quiet fear. Whenever strong winds swept across the hills, he would pause for a moment, remembering another storm, another night, Another version of himself who had nearly surrendered to the cold. Margaret never tried to erase those memories. She simply placed a warm cup of coffee beside him. Sometimes healing looked no larger than that. Late one July evening, the sky burned gold behind the mountains. Daniel walked into the house, holding the old pocketknife. Margaret recognized it immediately. "I've kept it safe," she said. "I know." He gently took the knife into his hands, running his thumb across the worn wooden handle. "The day I left this here," he smiled softly, "I honestly believed I'd never see this house again." Margaret remained silent. "I left it because I thought my journey was over." He slowly folded the blade closed. "But I was wrong." From the inside pocket of his jacket, Daniel removed a small velvet box. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't polished like something displayed in a city jewelry store. Inside rested a simple gold ring that reflected the evening sunlight. He looked at Margaret with the same quiet honesty she had first seen beside the fire months ago. "I don't have fancy speeches." She laughed through gathering tears. "I never expected one." Daniel took a slow breath. "That winter night, you gave a stranger a bowl of soup. You gave him a warm fire. You gave him a reason to believe tomorrow was worth seeing." He stepped one pace closer. "This time, I'd like to leave something far more valuable." He closed the pocketknife and laid it gently upon the kitchen table. Then he opened his hand toward her. "My heart." Margaret's eyes overflowed. She remembered the lonely mornings after William had passed. She remembered eating supper in silence. She remembered wondering whether happiness belonged only to younger people. And she remembered opening the door during a blizzard simply because another human being needed help. She slipped her hand into Daniel's. "You already left your heart here months ago. You just hadn't realized it yet." She nodded before he could ask another question. No grand proposal. No applause. Only two weathered hands finding each other across an old wooden table. Outside, Emma quietly stood on the porch, having arrived only moments earlier. She saw their joined hands through the open kitchen window. Instead of interrupting, she smiled. Her mother had not lost her past. She had simply found the courage to welcome another future. Years later, neighbors would still tell newcomers about the widow who opened her door during the worst snowstorm anyone could remember. Most would say the stranger came back with lumber, tools, and enough supplies to save an old ranch. But those who truly understood the story knew that wasn't what mattered most. The greatest gift Daniel ever carried back to that hillside wasn't inside the pickup trucks. It was the life he was finally ready to live. As the sun disappeared behind the Montana mountains, Margaret and Daniel sat together on the front porch. The same porch where one desperate winter night had begun with fear, now welcomed another peaceful evening with laughter drifting across the fields. The old porch light still hung above the door. It no longer waited for a lost traveler. It simply shined over a home that had been rebuilt by kindness. And if this story reminds you that even the smallest act of compassion can echo farther than we ever imagine, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes one bowl of soup is all it takes to begin a whole new life.